We're going to get started. I want to be respectful of everyone's time, so thank you for coming this evening. I am Ann Barrios. I am the High School Supervisor of Special Education for the district. And
I am Kim Bankus. I'm the district's Transition Coordinator.
So we will be talking tonight about transitioning to college with an IEP. We are recording this. It's not live streamed, but we will put it on our website under Pupil Services. So you won't be in the recording. You'll just be here with us, so it's great. So just to begin, we have a couple, and just to preface, if you have questions as we go, this is very informal. So any questions, just kindly raise your hand and we'll answer them as we go, but we will have a question and answer at the end, and we'll stay afterwards for any individual questions you have that you don't want to raise in front of the group. So understanding students' rights and responsibilities. Question number one, are there IEPs in college? So under the law, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, we are required as a school district and all school districts to provide students that are eligible for an IEP or Section 504 plan, with students specifically with an IEP we'll be talking about this evening. They are entitled, that is the key word that you will be hearing from us tonight, to a free appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And that includes making sure that we meet annually at least one time a year to review your child's IEP. And then there's required team members that must be present. The LEA, which is usually your assistant principal at the building. Sometimes the supervisor is there, sometimes the transition coordinator is there, but required is your LEA, parents, student, and a regular ed and special education teacher. And then any other team member that's also servicing your child. We're looking at what were the needs in the most recent evaluation report, what are the current needs, what are the goals that are going to address those needs, and what is the specially designed instruction that will make sure your student is making progress with their IEP goals. And then we report out that progress to you quarterly. Okay. And then this is also the laws instituted for all students in grades K through 12, although IDEA covers students from the age of 3 on.
So as Ms. Barrios said, our biggest word for tonight is eligibility versus entitled. So under IDEA, your student is entitled to certain services, and that transforms because the law that the student is serviced upon also changes. So when they are still under the umbrella of K through 12 and they have not accepted their diploma from their education, from their current high school, they are serviced under IDEA. Once they accept that diploma and they go on to a post-secondary setting, it now falls under Americans with Disability Act and Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. So that law says that students are now eligible for services, meaning that they have to qualify, and the same qualifications do not mandate under IDEA. The biggest thing is that they are going to be held to reasonable accommodations, and it is up to each post-secondary education setting to define what those reasonable accommodations are. Therefore, just because your student had an accommodation or a modification in high school does not guarantee that they are going to receive that. It is up to the college or the institution that's providing that service if they are eligible and if it's a reasonable accommodation that they can provide to them. It's also important to note that once a person has met the admission standards, when they are considered for the reasonable accommodations, it's still determined upon eligibility. So we're going to talk a little bit more as we go through tonight about documentation that's going to be needed for your student, and why that's important and how they make the determination off of that specifically. So reasonable accommodations can be made to provide equal access to an education, and under IDEA, we want the student to not only access the curriculum, but we want to ensure that they're making progress. For ADA and the Rehab Act, that making progress kind of goes away. In other words, institutions, post-secondary education institutions, do not have to make sure that your student is making progress. All the reasonable accommodations that are provided are just ensuring that the student can access the curriculum. Therefore, those progress reports, the IEP meetings, that's why they don't really exist anymore, because there's no accountability for that institution to make sure that that student is actually making progress in the curriculum.
So our processes and services comparison, when we're looking at high school versus post-secondary education, the school district will evaluate students every 3 years, unless students have an intellectual disability, then it's every 2 years. So the triennial evaluation will occur then to determine what are the current needs, and we follow those procedures. So after you receive that reevaluation report, we meet again in 30 days to develop an IEP, and at any time you can call an IEP meeting. After today's session, if you want to meet with your school team and have an IEP revision, that is your right at any time to convene an IEP meeting. Then we are also responsible for transportation. So even if the district, through the IEP, needs to provide another service to a student, such as attending the TCHS program for a career and technical program, we provide the transportation to that. We develop the IEP every year, and we maintain the progress monitoring and report that to you with the report cards quarterly. We monitor the effectiveness of the agreed upon services. So if a student is not making progress, it is our responsibility as the school district to make sure we're reconvening the IEP team and making changes to ensure that the student is making meaningful progress. And if they aren't, then we have to meet again and make changes to either include different services or supports, and we continue to monitor that. And it's at no cost to you. So anything that is recommended through the IEP as a service or support is paid for by the school district, as opposed to post-secondary.
So in post-secondary, again, the eligibility comes into play, and it's determined for the students' accommodations after the disclosure process. In other words, the big difference between a high school and a post-secondary placement is the post-secondary placement is not going to seek out your student if they need help. Just because that they do have an IEP or they're coming to college with a disability does not mean that they are automatically qualified for it, or that they're in fact going to, again, be sought out by the college. That big piece is disclosure. So your student has to disclose to the university or the college or the post-secondary placement in order to access any type of reasonable accommodations. And it is on them. If they do not take that step, they are not responsible to provide any reasonable accommodations. And I keep saying again, the reasonable accommodations, and we're going to get to a little bit later, is that don't expect what you have in high school to replicate what you can get in two schools. It is going to vary from school to school, so it's a really good inquiry process. When you're researching schools, it's okay to visit the Office of Disabilities. That would be your contact person or contact place for the students to disclose. And a good question to ask them is what typical accommodations or reasonable accommodations are provided to some of your students here. So of course it doesn't mean that your student is eligible for those, but typically the Office of Disabilities have a list of common accommodations that they already kind of provide. When you start kind of inquiring, you're going to see some colleges are a little bit more giving than others, but that could be a conversation into where you decide is a best fit for your student. So when we talk about the process for disclosure, it's absolutely necessary for your student to have that self-advocacy skill, because what is going to happen is they are no longer going to talk to you. So we're shifting a paradigm of you being an advocate for your student. You've got them all the way up through high school and graduation has come, and you've been such a huge supporter of them, and now they have to be able to do this independently. So what's really necessary is helping your student gain that independence and gaining those self-advocacy skills, because when they disclose, chances are you're not even going to be invited to the meeting. So they will go to the Office of Disabilities, they will schedule a meeting, and you could be right there with them, and they're going to say, I'm just going to take this student back, I'm going to have you wait out here. In other words, your student's going to have to be able to answer questions, provide the documentation, and advocate for their needs. So a lot of preparation can go into that, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that. But the actual process and what that looks like is scheduling an appointment with that Office of Disabilities. So the big thing to remember about that is, I always like to say, having accommodations is kind of like a safety net. So your student may go into college thinking, I'm not going to use any of these, this is nothing that I really need. I always encourage them to disclose anyways, because accommodations are not retroactive. So if you, let's say you start fall semester and things are going well, and then maybe you start dipping down and it comes around like October, November, and you realize, hey, maybe I really did need some accommodations, then they go and disclose, that's fine, they can do that at any point. But they can't go back and get services, and the grades that happened in September and October and November, whenever before they disclose, are going to stand because they don't go backwards. So it's better to kind of disclose up front and have that, and if you don't use it, then that's fine, rather than try to kind of go backwards and waste time in that sense. You need to submit documentation of your disability. Most post-secondary institutions are looking for a reevaluation report, okay? So that's a little different than the IEP. So you have an IEP typically annually or more if necessary. But that reevaluation is that report that happens every 3 years, providing that your student doesn't have the diagnosis of an intellectual disability, which is every 2 years. So that is the report that is done by the school psychologist. Yes.
So if, let's say your student is re-evaluated at the end of 11th grade or 12th grade, how many years is it valid to give to a university?
That's a very good question. So typically, and I'll just speak to my experience, and I'm familiar with most of the college within our surrounding area, they like to see a reevaluation report within 2 years, completed within 2 years. So what's going to happen is, which some students fall into, is, as I just said, by law, we're required to complete a reevaluation report every 3 years. So that's our mandate that we are upheld to. But yes, most colleges would look to have it within a recent 2 years. Okay. So once they submit the documentation, they can request certain accommodations at that meeting that they have with the Office of Disability. They will ask your student, what do you need and why? So your student's going to have to be able to answer, I need extra time to take tests. And then the question is, why do you need that? And they're going to have to be able to self-advocate that.
The reevaluation report versus an annual IEP meeting, is that like retesting? Or what is a reevaluation?
So the reevaluation report is the opportunity for the district to look at if the current programming and servicing for the student is still essentially working. Is the student still have the needs identified, and are we still programming for those identified needs? Typically, there is testing involved. Sometimes what will happen, the IEP team will determine that we can just do what we call a review of records. In other words, we determine no additional testing is needed. If that determination is made based upon we know what the needs are of the student, and we're making progress and we're meeting those needs. But it's a good question, because post-secondary education placements want to see updated testing. So when we say updated testing, we call them academic and achievement levels. So those are those IQ tests and the battery of the academic ability. So they do want to see that. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So yes, if we're talking to our guidance counselor or whoever, when we're going for the reevaluation, are parents allowed to request the academic and achievement levels, or is that automatically given if you are asking for a reeval?
So it would not necessarily be automatically given. Again, it's based on individual need. So as a parent, if you know your student is coming upon the reevaluation report and you know that they're going to need to access, you have every right as a parent to request additional testing for academic and achievement levels to be included in that reevaluation report.
So then if that was something that wasn't fully done and your child's heading, so then really it's you have to do private evaluation and testing in order to be able to provide that.
Right.
Correct.
So what our district practices is, it can be different at other school districts. So if you do decide to move in the meantime, for a district to complete a review of data, they really don't have to give you a permission to evaluate. We're just reviewing information we have and we're giving it to you. Our district practice is that we're going to give you a permission to evaluate either way, whether we're doing just a review of data or a review of data plus additional testing. So you will receive a permission to evaluate, usually 60 days prior to the evaluation being completed. What we practice at the high school level is at the 90 days before your triennial reevaluation report is due. So if it's due May 5th, we count back 90 days. At that point, the school team needs to meet to review the data to determine if additional testing is needed. Some students they have really good data, they know what the students' needs are, they don't have any other concerns about other suspected areas of disability, so a permission to evaluate will be issued to the parents at that time, and then when you receive that, you can write on there and say, I request additional testing, and when you sign your name on that, that does not give us permission to do anything. Anytime you write on a permission to evaluate with things that you want, we're required to then respond to that writing. So whenever you're giving a form by the district for a permission to evaluate, we have to then say, okay, well, this is what we're agreeing to do after considering what you wrote down, okay? Now, the IEP team can come together and review the data and say, no, we need additional testing. We have other areas of suspected disability. Maybe there's social and emotional concerns that we need to look at. We need to do behavior rating scales. We might be looking at that more so at the high school level than cognitive and achievement. We usually have the data on that. The high school level, we're looking more sometimes, not all the time, at the social and emotional concerns.
I'm curious, you're going to see my hand pop up a million times. So I never thought of this aspect of, because we're hoping that our son with an IEP will go off to college,
Right.
whether part-time or full-time. So I never thought about it. Is there any negative side effects? Let's say you have your child evaluated for a social emotional need. And let's say the data shows that, yes, your child in fact has a weakness in social or emotional. If the colleges see that, do they, is that a factor in applying, or is that under the America with Disabilities Act they cannot?
Right. So the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, have protections, and so does the Rehab Act under 504. It's a Civil Rights Act. Says they cannot be discriminated upon solely based upon a disability. So for the admissions process, for entrance, I always tell my students I wouldn't necessarily disclose then. Apply like you would any, an atypical student without a disability. Apply. Once you get accepted, that is when you go disclose with the Office of Disabilities. Of course, it is against the law to discriminate, but just to have that in surety. And then plus two, once you know where you're going, you don't want to go and disclose to 5 different, post-secondary placements. Once the student has identified exactly where they're going, it would be appropriate to identify that Office of Disabilities and disclose at that time. So just kind of going back to here about the process. So if additional evaluations are required, it is upon the student at that time. So if they did provide documentation and the post-secondary placement determined additional documentation is needed, again, maybe another cognitive or achievement testing, that would be up, the financial responsibility would be on the student to provide that. Transport self to class, so like Ms. Barrios was saying, the district is responsible for picking your student up and taking them to school, and if they would go to like a TCHS or anything like that, obviously that now at a college level, the student is responsible to get themselves to class. Monitor the effectiveness of his or her accommodations. There is no IEP team. It kind of goes back to that we're no longer ensuring that the student is making progress. The accommodations are there solely to ensure that they have equal access, not necessarily to make progress. That's not the goal. And follows institution's academic progress and code of conduct practices and subject to outline consequential actions if not upholding standards. In other words, ADA and the Rehab Act do not protect your student against if they are not following any of the set policies and procedures. Every post-secondary education placement has an academic policy. In other words, you can't fall below a certain GPA, or you have to maintain a certain GPA in order to continue to be enrolled as a student. So if for some reason your student has disclosed, is receiving all the accommodations that they asked for, and is, again, still not making progress and maybe is failing out of all their classes, they are still upheld to essentially be kicked out or asked to leave from the college if they are not following that academic policy. So the Rehab Act and ADA is not going to protect your student in that case. Okay. So every post-secondary institution has outlined admissions requirements. So it's really important when your student is searching and researching to find out what those requirements are. I always say transition planning is kind of like the mapping backwards. Like think about that like a big funnel. Like you want to start with that top and you want to work to the bottom. So where's that target? Where's that outline of where you want to see your student? And if it's at a post-secondary placement, what do they need to do their senior year, junior year, so on and so forth, to be able to get up to those steps. So finding out specifically what those requirements are from your institution is that first step. So you know what courses you need to take, if you need to take some entrance like the SAT or ACT, if they're looking at certain GPAs or class ranks, community volunteer, any of those, most colleges will outline what they are looking for. ADA and Section 504 do not guarantee admissions, okay? So your student is not guaranteed just because they have a disability that they get into the college. All it guarantees is that they cannot be discriminated upon. In other words, the college cannot say, you cannot come to this college because you have a disability. That would be illegal. They cannot do that. And that's the only thing that really guarantees. If a student may not be discriminated yet based upon their disability. And then even after acceptance, we talked about that. There may still be additional requirements and qualifications if they're going into a certain program. So they could be accepted to a college, and maybe they want a very specific program, and a lot of colleges have kind of like a probationary period, or even you have to complete so many academic requirements and then show additional requirements to get in, so it's an additional GPA or an additional servicing that they have to complete. And again, ADA and Rehab Act do not guarantee that. All they're going to guarantee is that they receive reasonable accommodations based upon eligibility.
So the differences between high school and college and who's involved in the education. So at the high school level, we have some listed here: parents, teachers, counselors, but it includes the student's case manager. They're pretty much your main go-to at this point if you have a concern related to the IEP or anything in general. Plus you have your club advisors if they're involved in clubs, coaches, your grade level assistant principal, and a plethora of other people that are all here as a collective team to provide your child with a well-rounded education so that they're prepared for post-secondary education. But then once they go on to college, then it's the student and the family. So there's still resources out there, but then you have to reach out for them, okay? That's the main difference. So concerns that some parents face, not all but some, are they going to be prepared to be on their own in college? Are they prepared to go on to college and still be at home? Are they preparing to go on to college and commute? Or are they preparing to go on to college and move away from home? So then you have to think, well, what skills are they going to need to achieve that goal? And you want to start working on that now. You have to practice. I tell my own son at home, he's an 8th grader, you're not just going to arrive when you turn 18 and everything's just going to fall into place. We have to be practicing all these things now. So I might not be the cool mom, but I'm going to be the mom that's going to make sure you're going to be ready to do what you want to do after you graduate. So one of those things can they wake up on their own? Do they have an alarm clock that they have to wake up with? Medication, are they taking medication during the school day? Well, it's the nurse's responsibility to make sure they're taking the medication. Oh, but Johnny didn't come down for his medicine. Well, where is he at period 5? Let me see, okay, let me call the teacher. Can you please send Johnny down to take his medicine? He's not gonna have that. He or she is not gonna have that when they are in college. These are just some examples. Limited access, we're gonna get into what FERPA is, so I'm just gonna pause that. In 2 slides, we'll talk about what FERPA is, and that's more with parent limited access. So right now, you have access to anything related to your child's education and to a number of adults that can answer your questions. Plus, with technology, you have access to the parent portal and Schoology and your students' IEPs, not so when they're in college. So we'll talk about what you have access to and how you would gain access. What about courses that were waived in high school? So through the IEP, we can waive a lot of things. If students attend the technical college high school, then usually a social studies requirement is waived. So, but then maybe also a language is waived. So we know with graduating, we need 4 credits of English, 4 credits of social studies, 3 credits of math, 3 credits of science, and then there's another credit of either math, science, or a language. So students may not take a language in high school, but they might major in a program that requires it. So how do you navigate that? So you might have to take a remediation class over the summer. And I wouldn't call it a remediation class, but you might have to enroll in another class aside from your program that's going to cost you a little bit extra than the regular tuition so that you're prepared to take the class. Yes?
Does the district, because we're on that situation, and I'm noticing that a lot of the schools that my son's looking at they recommend, not require, 2 years of a foreign language. So since he hasn't done a foreign language yet, and I'm trying to find the easiest foreign language for him, I'm thinking of enrolling him next year in 2 classes, being Spanish 1 and then that Spanish that's like about culture.
Okay.
Can you take 2 foreign languages at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I would talk to your guidance counselor just to make sure that it's not going to knock out another requirement at that time.
Right.
Some of them have like a prerequisite, so I would have to kind of look back at the course of study to see if one of them has a prerequisite versus another, because obviously you need to take one before you take the other.
Yeah, I looked at that for ours, and there isn't. I guess because the culture one is different than the Spanish one.
And I think being open to alternatives is really the key here when we talk about having a solid transition plan for your student. So necessarily what obviously might work for one student is not always going to work for another. We want your student to be successful. We want them to make progress. So as you're making these IEP team decisions, sometimes you just have to think creatively, like maybe utilizing the summer to access a different class. Maybe looking at some of the college opportunities as well. In other words, sometimes you can go in as undeclared. And that kind of gets you into the college to get acceptance. You get some of your prerequisite skills and some of your general education classes under your belt, and then you can apply to a specific program. So there's kind of always like alternatives, a way around it. But I think the big takeaway is, just because a college says you have to get there, you still want to make sure that your student is feeling successful, because and you brought this up, so I'm just going to put you out there. You don't want to put them in 2 classes and then have them fail. That's not the point. That's not good transition planning, just so we can say that we met that requirement. It's okay to talk to the admissions counselors at the college that you're choosing and see if they have any recommendations, saying, do you have any summer programs or do you have any alternatives, and looking at different ideas like that.
Does the district do anything? So I know that the district has online classes, but for a kid with an IEP that might have a learning disability, online foreign language is probably tricky. Do they ever, I haven't seen anything because I've been looking, that teaches foreign language in the summer, but a traditional classroom setting?
So every summer, it gets evaluated what classes are going to be offered. And any class that is offered through the district, we need to honor whatever is in the IEP. So whatever agreed upon services and programming is within the IEP, that student is still eligible for, even if it's during the summer.
I'm sorry, say that again?
So, Every year, it's a little different about what classes are offered during the summer, I'll be honest with you. And so that gets evaluated and, you know, that gets put out. But whatever class that a student takes, if it's through the district, we still have to uphold that student's IEP. So whatever is outlined as far as the programming and servicing still needs to be implemented, even if it's a summer class. So all the accommodations and specially designed instruction still need to be given to that student, even if it's a summer class.
But even if you're choosing to do the summer class because he's missed other stuff?
Yes, yes, if it's offered through the district. Yes, yep, he's eligible for that based upon those agreed upon services in the IEP.
So the other one that I didn't touch on yet is, can't you make my student? So when we're looking at the specially designed instruction and the accommodations in the IEP, so the ones that we're required to put in for specially designed instruction are providing direct explicit instruction in the skills that they need related to their IEP goals. And then other accommodations that will help support those IEP goals. But sometimes we add a lot of extras too. So look at those extras at your next IEP meeting and see what ones you can start to see. Does my student really need this all the time? Or are there certain classes that they need it? So such as maybe adapted tests and having multiple choice questions and only having 3 choices instead of 4. Do they need that for all classes, or are there just certain classes that they need it for? Just want to slowly look at that because in college, they're going to see adapted tests, and then they may or may not give them that. So what adapted tests look like in the district and what we specify in the specially designed instruction, exactly what we're going to do. College can say, well, we're going to do this, but this is all we're doing. So just know that. And then other comparisons we have here between high school and college, and these aren't exact, but it just gives you a frame of reference. So they go to school for 5 or 6 hours a day. They have 2 to 3 hours a day of homework. It might be more than that, depending on the class or how long it may take them to complete it. They have frequent formative quizzes and summative assessments at the end of every course that they take. We teach the content related to the state standards, and we use our curriculum for that. 20 to 30 students in a general education classroom, less so in a special education classroom, and then they're in one school building. They might transition to the technical college high school, but they're still in that one building for part of the day. Versus in college, it can look very much different.
So yeah, in college, you can definitely have up to 4 to 5 classes within a given week, but they're usually longer in length, so 3 to 4 hours a day. The hours for assignment and homework are going to vary. Typically, you're not going to get necessarily much homework, but it's more assignment-based. However, but the amount of hours that you need to put in for those classes, it's not necessarily going to be just 2 to 3 hours. It could be 2 to 3 hours for each class that you're taking, so not just looking at as a whole. 2 to 3 cumulative exams, like per semester. So the difference here is because we're making sure our students are making progress, your teacher is going to evaluate the student. So those frequent assessments, or what we might say, looking at how the student is making so that they can intervene or they can kind of reteach a topic to your student or things like that. That doesn't really happen in college. You might get a class where you get maybe two cumulative tests. In other words, maybe kind of like a midterm and a final, and that's what your grade is comprised of. So there's no kind of availability to look at how you're progressing through. Research and reading is going to be completely on the student. Okay, so what your student might be accustomed to now is maybe some light reading outside of class, and then it's applied in the classroom. And what they could anticipate in a atypical college setting is they need to read maybe 2 to 3 chapters a night, come to class, and be prepared to apply that, or they're already moving on to other chapters because the professor has assumed you've already gained that knowledge. So it's going to be a lot more of an independent take on researching and reading. It depends. 10 to 300 students in a specific class. So you and your student really have to identify what's important to them and what kind of environment do they learn best in. And this is a very good question just to ask and research when you start looking at different colleges, is what kind of classes are offered and how big they are. If your student is not really affected by the number of students, maybe sitting in a class of 200, it doesn't affect them. Maybe that's not really anything that significantly alters their ability to make progress. But if you know that maybe they do work well in a smaller setting, making a personal connection with that professor, because I'm going to tell you right now, in a class of 200, that professor probably does not know your student's name by just looking at them. So if they need something more of like a little personal connection, that's going to be really important for them to target and hone in on when you're looking for a best fit for your student. And then, of course, accessing the entire campus is going to be your next big difference. So, although our high schools are pretty big, to be honest, we do have that going for us, it's still going to be different, again, if they're going to a bigger campus. And also, if you're all the way up here on the north side of a campus and you have a class within like 20 minutes and you have to get all the way down there, how are they going to navigate that and getting there independently and making sure that they can...
You're going to hate me.
Absolutely.
Okay. So I have questions. So, I'm getting all this stuff in my head that college is so much different than high school. So this is my question. Mm-hmm. So when you're trying to come up with your transition plan for your student, keeping in mind all these kind of executive functioning things that they have to be able to do, and you envision that at some point you think that they are going to get there, but what if when they're like in the middle, like the end of 11th grade, early 12th grade, and you're like, I don't know if they're really going to be able to do that. Can you talk about a transition plan that would include that post-grad program with dual enrollment possibilities? How does that all work? Is that a possibility? Is that?
So I think I may answer your question, if not, redirect me here. When we talk about really starting to transition that student into that identified post-secondary placement, Downingtown does offer dual enrollment, and that is an excellent way for our students to start getting exposure to a collegiate level course while still remaining under the high school umbrella and still receiving the services as if they would through their IEP. So that definitely could be an option if that student wants to experience what maybe a college level course is and the demands and the academic ability of a college level course, but again, still remaining within our services.
But can you do that? I'm not talking about doing that your senior year. I'm talking about after, can you delay your graduation and then let's say you feel like in the transition plan your kid still needs, I'm looking at the navigating the campus and chunking up homework and planning ahead and all that stuff. Does I've heard rumors that the post-grad program helps with that. Mm-hmm. And so could your student then spend time in the post-grad program while they're actually taking a college course so that there's somebody monitoring those skills?
Sure. Do you know what I mean? So I understand what you're asking, and I'm not trying to skate your question, but really the answer is it's individualized. It's up to the individual what their needs are and what the team determines is most appropriate as we program for the student. So again, I don't mean to push you off, but that is a really good question for your IEP team to help make that determination. The short answer is, as we look at transitional needs for any student, any needs that we identify, we want to make sure that we service and help that student make that transition. But that is an excellent question to open up to your IEP team and have that dialogue and what makes the most sense for each of your individual students. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
So when you're looking at these next 4 years, wherever you're at in that continuum of your ninth grade students all the way to seniors, your IEP team has to answer 2 questions. They have to answer, did the student earn their credits to graduate? Did you want a standards aligned diploma? So do they have their 24 credits to graduate? Even if certain courses were waived, so we've waived the social studies if you're a TCHS student, but we don't waive necessarily the 24 credit requirement. So they might have just gotten other classes, including the 2.83 credits for attending TCHS every year and passing. The other question beyond that 24 credits is, are they on track to meet their transition outcomes? Not that they've achieved their transition outcomes. So their transition outcome is what you see at the top of that transition grid on the IEP, where they have an outcome to attain a 2 or 4 year post-secondary am I saying that right?
Mhm.
The outcome of going
Yes.
to a 2 or 4 year post-secondary
Obtaining the
college.
academic and functional
And
skills.
possibly
yes.
majoring in nursing. And we put possibly in because they could change, but it just gives who's ever reading that IEP an idea, if they're looking at that page and not the present ed levels, which say similar things. Then they have an employment goal, they're gonna work competitively, be competitively employed. And when we're talking about supportive employment, we're talking about providing supports to that student, meaning usually a person that would help them with their job, such as a job trainer. That's what we're talking about with supportive employment. So most of our students will receive competitive employment, and some of our students need supportive employment. And they are receiving supports and services currently to help them meet that goal, if that's their goal. And then independent living skills. So our teachers every year will give an annual transition assessment. And for students that are receiving learning support services, I'll say make sure you give that independent living skills transition assessment early, because if there's any skills we need to be working on, we want to work on them now. And sometimes it's related to organizational skill instruction or social and coping skill instruction, because if you don't have those skills, you might have to still continue to work on them. But just want to say, you could be on track to achieve that outcome and have the skills. I mean, executive functioning specifically, your prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until you're mid to late 20 to 30 years old. So there's adults that have, that still struggle with the executive functioning. So it's important that we're teaching the skills, and then how often are they applying them? And what other things do we need to work on to help them apply those skills? When you're going to colleges, go and tour and see what it's like. If there's a true college that you're interested in, I'll speak to Millersville because I adjunct for them. Look at the course of study. Hey, they're interested in majoring in nursing. I'll just stick with nursing. Look to see what classes are offered for that. Look at what courses they'll have to take as a freshman and see how often they're offered. Is it one time for a 3-hour class? Is it hybrid, where like we have blended here, that might be called hybrid in the university setting, where you are face-to-face certain days of the week and then you're online the rest of the time? Or it can be completely online. Or you can have a combination of those things. So see what's offered and plan for that. The other thing we want to focus on is office hours. So each professor will have office hours that the student will go to. And they're at the top of the syllabus. So you want to be sure that your student knows what that means, that you have to go see the professor with your questions and be prepared with those questions. So how do we practice that now? Well, we go to our teacher. And maybe our teacher's not available when we have study halls. So how else can we access them? Well, I can email them with what my concern is. And then, is there a time that I can set up to meet with you? Those are the skills you want to practice now that will align to what you'll have to do in college. So FERPA, note about FERPA. So the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act states that parents of children who attend or have attended a school or facility that receives state funding has rights under FERPA to access educational information, including progress. So when your child goes, and they won't be a child, so you're a young adult, goes to college, they're gonna get their syllabus, and towards the end, it'll have the FERPA rights. So there'll be a form that they will have to fill out, and I'll have Ms. Banka speak to this further. But when a student turns 18, so this is 18 and having their diploma. So once they have their diploma with the 18, I just want to have that caveat.
Yes.
Some students continue to receive services through age 21. But once they have their diploma and enter a post-secondary institution at any age, all rights afforded to parents under FERPA transfer to the student. So this is where we talked about you are entitled to information. Now you have to be eligible for the information. So you have to follow the FERPA policy. So FERPA provides ways in which a school may, but is not required to share information from an eligible student educational record with parents without the student's consent. So you will have to go and figure out with each university what their FERPA policy is, and then the students have to sign that you will have access to their information related to their education. But then the amount of information you might have access to depends on each university.
Right, yes, yeah. I was just saying, yeah, it's still like limited, and it's again really up to the college, and you're going to hear that a little bit more too. It's up to the post-secondary education placement about what their specific FERPA policy is. So if sometimes your student has to sign that form once a semester, and sometimes they might just be signing it once, and it's good for their entire enrollment. So if that's something that you and your student determine that you want to have access to, again, inquiring specifically about what the FERPA requirements are, and what those policy and procedures look like for that student. In addition to when we talked about shifting the driver from the team-based to now just the student, it's not common for a professor to answer any phone calls or emails from you. So even with the FERPA, the FERPA signature, even with that policy in place, do not always anticipate that the professor is going to respond to your questions, because even though you are eligible, okay, for that information, you are not entitled to it. In other words, they don't have to respond to you, and if they don't get back to your email, they don't call you back, they're not really, there's not laws that they're breaking because you're not entitled, you're just, you're eligible for it.
I know this is a gross generalization, but like, what does a typical FERPA policy look like for, let's say, a Westchester University? Like, is it, you know how we have a portal? Is it usually like if the child signs off, the parents have access to read what the data is on the portal? Is it only academic, or is it also emotional if they get emotional support at a university?
Yeah, it's any academic profile or any services that they come into. Most universities have some type of mental health component. In other words, like they have counseling services. When you specifically talk about emotional, that typically falls under another one, because now they're going to be held to the HIPAA law, which we all kind of know about, right? So they kind of fall into another category, and typically they don't follow the FERPA. The FERPA is specifically for education and academic.
Okay. Is most of the FERPA, like most of the universities, I know that's a gross generalization, but do they have a portal like our Schoology where kids in college log on and you could kind of see what?
Yes. Most colleges have some type of, like you said, we have Schoology. Blackboard is a big one for a lot of the universities and colleges around here. Some database that has, their progress on there. If you have a good relationship with your kids, just get your kids login, right? There you go. And then you can see what they're seeing. Yeah, you know what I mean? But then, you might on Monday log in and the password has been changed. You run the risk of that, but, there's so it just keeping.
I can't tell you how many parents have warned me that their kids had IEPs, went off to college, they said, oh, I'll tell you, Mom. And they were embarrassed because they were struggling. They didn't go get the help. Their grades got, dropped down. The parents, of course, don't find out till it's too late. And so I was just curious what this FERPA entitles you to. Like,
you're eligible for the information. If the student gives consent to the university, you're eligible to receive information. You're not entitled to it. But that could include that you do get access to some type of online portal. But again, it's up to the institution about what their exact policy is.
Do you know what Westchester, not that Westchester.
I do not, off the top of my head, I'll be honest, I do not. But I think the big takeaway here is certainly modeling for your student, just you're still their support system. Where, you've been their advocate, you've been there supporting them this whole time. You don't go away. Just because technically that IEP has disappeared, you don't go away. So the more you can just build that communication with them and just say, if you still need help, just reach out, just talk to me. And I know kids get, I'm failing, mom and dad are gonna be mad, and like, that's a big thing. But yeah.
That's a question to ask the university when you go and tour.
Absolutely.
What their FERPA policy is and what that gives you access to.
So college readiness. So just some things that have been identified as successful indicators. So things you can kind of work on now to get your student to that post-secondary placement is resiliency. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Communication, interpersonal skills. Again, not just now with the world of phones, we see this declining more and more. It's still essential for your student to interact with individuals, they're going to have to speak to their professors and things like that. So encouraging that communication as much as possible. The executive functioning skills, self-regulation skills, and they do have to have a foundation of an academic ability to be able to be successful.
I have a question. So can you go back to that slide before?
Certainly.
So how do you know, I know this is crazy, you're a parent and you have your ideas of what you think your kid might be able to handle, but like, is there some readiness test or something? Like, how do you know that your kid is resilient enough? Or their executive functioning is good enough? Like, is there some?
Yeah, we're going to talk about it. There's some
Okay.
tips here on how to kind of build some of
Okay.
these things, so it maybe will give you a little bit of a framework to work off of. It's a good question.
But it's one more slide away.
Yeah, it's next.
So whether in middle or high school, if an IDEA eligible student is planning to attend college, there are a number of critical steps so that they're college ready. So one suggestion is taking courses that they're interested in and seeing if they like it. Students go to TCHS and they don't like the chosen field that they did, they can shadow another one and take another program. So same with a course. Just do it kind of within that drop bag period if you can.
Right.
So there's many opportunities that we have here at the district.
I just want to say real quick, electives. Electives are our best friend, okay? Your student has to take electives as part of that 24 credits, so they have to take those classes anyways. It is a fantastic way to kind of get experience and exposure into things that they may or may not be interested in. Taking a course and finding out you have no interest in it whatsoever still holds value, because now we know what you don't like. So don't underestimate electives.
Being involved in school and community activities, being involved in all the clubs that are offered at all of the high schools is a wonderful opportunity, and then that's something that they can then add to their resume and to their application. Anything that's related to their career and using that for their senior project, what they're interested in, these are all opportunities and skills to build. And also, I want to just touch here, the career readiness standards that the state recently passed require the school district to provide even more career readiness programming starting at the elementary level. So it's really a big push. So there'll be, if you're thinking there aren't too many opportunities, we're continuing to expand them. Up till today, I think we got 2 emails about different opportunities for internships for our students that we're pushing out to everybody. Students with disabilities and not with disabilities. So that will continue to grow.
Meeting with your school guidance counselor. So our guidance counselors meet with their students at least once a year, if not more. But please encourage your student at that time to utilize that time. So a lot of times students get called in, the guidance counselor goes, do you have any questions? I don't know. Well, no, they're not prepared for it. So when you know that that's approaching, when that's coming, come prepared with questions. They are an excellent resource, even probably more so, about specific, especially about like the surrounding ones. You'd be surprised, do you know about the Westchester FERPA? So some of those questions that maybe you still want to ask the institutions, your guidance counselors can still be a resource for that. But my biggest thing for that is certainly to be prepared and to work with your student in identifying maybe some questions about like what are some of the admissions, or where can I find the information, or do you have a contact of somebody I can call or email to get additional information? So utilize that time with that school counselor to the fullest. And then be an active participant during the IEP meetings, okay? That is so crucial. Not only is it the law that your student participates in the IEP, but it is a wonderful opportunity to just practice those self-advocacy skills and to start talking about what they need and why, because that's what they're ultimately going to have to do to get those reasonable accommodations. So they have to be present, they have to be a participant, and we can take steps towards that, but it's really crucial that they do take that active role.
And even the Pennsylvania Department of Ed and PTAN, that when all of us go to trainings for it, they really want that student-led IEP. So be mindful at your next IEP meeting of who is speaking. Usually it's the case manager speaking and the parent, but it really needs to be the student speaking. What are your needs? Let's look at them. What are your needs? What are your goals? And what specially designed instruction do you need? What does your data look like? You're working on this executive functioning goal. What does that look like? How can we continue to help you with that? Have them start speaking more. So it's not just being present and sitting there at the meeting,
active.
it's talking, because it just gives them practice with people that they know. And Naviance is another resource that you have access to as parents that has a plethora of information about colleges and career inventories, and that's a great resource as well. Just want to make sure we said that.
So we were talking a little bit about resiliency. So here are some things that we can start doing now to kind of prepare a student for that. Accommodate only as needed. So we call that programming for independence. In other words, we're programming, we're fading those supports, we're getting that student ready for not having as much support, because again, not necessarily what they get in high school is what they're going to be able to be eligible for once they do graduate from us. So looking at what is the absolute necessary accommodations that my student needs to still make progress, because we want to prepare them for that. Allow for some risks, okay? So don't program it to the T where, we're not allowing them to kind of expand and to kind of explore. It's kind of the age-old, there's lessons to be learned if they fail. No, don't take fail as, they absolutely have to fail, fail out, of course. But if they want to take a risk, allow them to do that. That does build resiliency, okay? Teach problem solving, modeling, okay? Sitting down with your student, I have this project and I don't know what to do. Okay, well, how can you solve this problem? Well, I went to my teacher during study hall and she wasn't there. She wasn't there. Okay, what's something else we can do? So guided practice, guiding them through a problem, and don't give them the answers. Let them try to figure it out. Is going to help build some of that resiliency. Teach your students skills for living independently. Okay, so this might sound silly, but have them do the laundry, take them to the groceries, give them the grocery store list, go. Have them start cooking meals. So some of these skills you kind of overlook, thinking, yeah, they know what's going on. No, they haven't, Mom. You've been making dinner for the past 18 years. They don't know how to turn the stove on. So it's okay to start having them do some of those responsibilities. And again, ask more how questions than why. Having them really navigate that thought process and guiding them through that.
Just be aware that they're watching you at all times, and I think it's a different type of work when when students continue to get older and now you have young adults. I don't think it's necessarily easier. They're not running around like little kids that you have to make sure that you're keeping safe, but I think it's a different worry and a different concern and a different work that is still highly valuable and needed. So they're still watching you. So model resiliency yourself when things don't go your way or things just don't work out and it's a hard day. So just be mindful of what you're doing and do more think alouds with your kids. Don't provide all the answers. Help them problem solve. Avoid talking in catastrophic terms. So if they failed the midterm or they failed something, okay, that's a situation. How can we make it better? It's not you always do this. Turn it around so that we can think of it in a positive way and help them problem solve through it. Let them make mistakes, because the mistakes that they make now, you can kind of control a little bit and support along the way, but once they're in college, and especially if they go away, you want to be sure that they know how to make right choices. And what happens when they start making wrong choices, and who do they go to for support? So the more you can help them with solving the mistakes that they make now, the more successful they can be in the future. And help them manage their emotions and what that looks like. Having that downtime, having that no phone time where they have to focus on being present beyond just being present at school. There's just a number of different things that we can do to help them with whether it be deep breathing or just taking a break or problem-solving steps. Who the resources will be at school, at the college for them. We had talked about that there might be counseling services available. You would just want to know all the supports that you have. Or just managing emotions might be, I don't know how to do this assignment. It's really long, it's this big research paper. I don't know how to do it without someone being next to me, chunking the assignment down. Where do I go? Oh, you can probably go to your professor, but you also can go to the library and there's different resources there. So talking about where the supports are.
So when we're talking about disclosure and self-advocacy, we talked a little bit before, if the student requires those accommodations, they must disclose. So some helpful tips as it relates to that is know the post-secondary institution policy and procedures ahead of time. Again, that intake meeting I was kind of referring to, and we talked about the documentation too. It needs to be completed by the student, but just knowing what those are and prepping their student is going to result in the best chance for success. We talked also about what services are not retroactive. So like I said, it's always best to disclose up front. And like everything has a timeline, okay? So, and it's up to the institution, but they may disclose in August, but they might not get their services into the end of September. So keeping those timelines, everything takes time, especially when it comes to paperwork. Keeping those in mind, that it's not like you go in there on Monday and Tuesday might be good to go. So making sure your student has adequate planning when it comes to that. And students must still advocate to the individual professors. So if you received one of the handout, and there is up here if you did not, once they do disclose, one of the handouts is an example of Westchester University of what a accommodations letter would look like. So once they do disclose to the professor, they will receive from the Office of Disabilities a disclosure letter. Then they have to take this letter and still disclose to each individual professor.
Oh, it's not automatically?
No, it is not automatic, okay?
That last page on the syllabus that they want to read.
Yes.
That talks about FERPA, and if they have a disability, how to disclose it, because then professors might list. And it's usually standard from the university, what their policy is.
Yes, yeah.
That's so different from here, where in high school or in our school, everybody is.
Right, yeah. So, and no one's
So you
going to
could
be...
go through this whole process, and if your kid doesn't show the teacher the letter, okay.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And again, and it's not retroactive. So even if they did disclose come in August and everything's going well, and they didn't meet the professor and they didn't provide the letter and they come up in November and say, I need these services, yeah, they can be eligible at that point, but they can't go back either. So even though they disclosed the Office of Disabilities back then, it all comes down to providing that disclosure and that self-advocacy point. And it depends, again, like Ms. Barrios said, check that syllabus, because although there might be a standard of, giving the letter and that should suffice, some professors might require a meeting with the student, and they might say the same thing, okay, I got this letter, but what do you need and why? So just the more you can practice with that student self-advocating those narratives, the better. Sorry. So in conclusion, we're going to ensure that your student's transition plan is geared towards programming for independence, that fading of supports. I can tell you right now, just again, speaking from personal experience within the local areas of colleges, when we talk about modifications and accommodations, modifications is when we're actually changing something, we're changing the outcome. Most commonly, you would see those adaptive tests or those modified tests. There's not modifications in colleges, okay? Your student will not typically receive a modification. I've not, in my experience, ever really seen that. I have seen the reasonable accommodations, because that's what ADA and Rehab Act outline is appropriate. So if your student is exempt from the writing portion of tests and they only have to do the multiple choice, not going to get that at a college setting. So starting planning now of, is this something you still need? And how often do you use it? And why do you use it, okay? Or maybe you can start looking, well, I only kind of need it in science, but all the other classes, I'm okay. Great, let's start there. So, starting to fade that heavy supports, okay? Helping your student understand their strengths, needs, and how to advocate for help. That comes with practice. Knowing the lingo. So one of the things that comes up, I used to teach a class called Freshman Seminar, and we use the word disability, and that's a really, for lack of better words, frightening to some students, okay, because it really puts a label on them. But they have to know the language and they have to be comfortable using it. So that is a federally mandated term, the student has a disability or the person has a disability. A lot of times, our students will be asked, do you have a disability? And they kind of get taken, no, I don't have a disability. Like there's nothing wrong with me. I don't have a disability, because they kind of think about something more significant than what it is. So just having your student be comfortable with the language is really important for them, okay? And then the building resiliency in your student for college preparation, which we talked about.
Researching the program. So if you're planning to go to a college and tour it, research it ahead of time so you know what questions to ask. Even from tonight's session, if you have questions that you want to ask every university, start jotting them down, because sometimes when you're at the university, you're going to forget what you want to ask as the parent. But then also ask your student to write down what questions they have so they can start getting comfortable asking questions with you being there and supporting them. See what necessary documentation, policies, and procedures are for the schools that you're interested in pursuing, and enjoy the journey. I think this is an exciting time, as much as it is scary, and I get it because I somewhat get it. I'm missing it tonight. My son has his course selection night, so I didn't look at that calendar when we scheduled this one. Enjoy it. Enjoy this time. I think it's a wonderful experience. Having gone through college, and we're still going through college, and where you sometimes go isn't where you first set out, and that's okay. Mm-hmm. So the more that they can be okay with that, and you be okay with that, I think the better off you'll be. And just take it step by step. The school is here to support you. We have our transition handouts, and we have other ones available as well. We also have some helpful websites that we've included, and if you signed in and gave me your email address, I will send you this PowerPoint so that you have access to it. But these are different websites that are available for transition. Secondarytransition.org is one, collegeboard.org, Naviance, your students have Naviance accounts. And then Kim can talk about the other two.
Yep, so the National Council on Disability, it's a very friendly view of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Rehab Act. So if you wanted to check that out, because those are the laws that your student is going to be protected under. And then the AccuPlacer, Delaware County Community College is our local one that uses this, but a lot of other colleges could use that. It's a placement test to determine if that student essentially has that academic ability to be able to enter the college. And a lot of times, if the student takes that test, sometimes they offer those remedial courses in the summer, like a remedial math or remedial English. So that AccuPlacer one, there's some practice questions on there to kind of get your student, when we talk about that academic ability, maybe to look into some of those areas that they need to maybe hone in on and strengthen. But it's just examples on there.
Shocking, right? Shocking. Yeah. So can you speak to, I've seen on different pamphlets and stuff, more official transition camps in the summer, so that your kid goes off to a college and spends 2 weeks, and it sounds like it's they're practicing all these things that you're talking about. Do you have any recommendations? Have you heard of any? Do you think they're good? Can you speak to that?
Mm-hmm. So maybe what I'll do is include it in that email. Every college has, again, under their supports of what they can offer, some colleges have specific programs geared towards helping students with disabilities, and some don't have any because it's up to the college. But I can include that information in looking towards it. Just for your own personal frame of reference, most of those programs are going to be out-of-pocket cost. But again, maybe that's a family decision that you would have to make if you think that the services that they're offering is something worthwhile.
Have you heard any feedback from anybody who's been to one, whether they thought it was worthwhile?
So a lot of colleges, here's my personal recommendation. A lot of colleges have services for all the students. In other words, they have a writing lab that every student who is on campus can go and have their papers edited by someone. They have a math lab that every student can go get free tutoring for math. They have study groups and things like that. So in looking at that, I always recommend to the student, within those natural supports, most students can be successful. Certainly it's a family decision, individual decision. I wouldn't want to waver you one way. A lot of those programs, what they'll offer is additional meeting times with an academic advisor. But every college has academic advisors, and kind of similar to the guidance counselor, well, they're only required to meet with you like once a semester or twice a semester. You can make an appointment with your academic advisor at any time. You know what I mean? Just because they're only required once doesn't mean that's what you're limited to. That's that self-advocacy skill. You know you're struggling, go make an appointment with your academic advisor. And again, most colleges have free tutoring because a lot of education majors have to get in so many service hours, and what do education majors love to do? We love to tutor. So, you know what I mean? So your campuses typically have services available to every student, and I would just encourage when you're making that decision is to inquire about all services versus what really stands out to pay for it, because you're going to pay so much for college. What makes the most financial sense?
Every college we looked at has everything you said, and it's all included in your tuition.
It's already, you're already paying for it. Those lovely fees, you're already paying for it.
I think the benefit of those summer programs is to see how your child socially, emotionally deals with some of what, like you can't, there's no way to mimic that part of.
But so maybe you could, so we did this with my son. He thought he was interested in computer science. So we signed him up for a computer science class through IE Tech that was held at Westchester.
Thank you for coming.
All different, different colleges. And it gave him a chance for 1 week to live in a dorm, see how he was doing, check out the campus. I mean, they didn't offer specific additional guided services, but it gave him a flavor of, I like it, I don't like it, I found it interesting, met some people, and it gave him a chance to look at that campus. So that's something that potentially, and they probably have them for whether it's writing or computer science or something else. If you do some Google searching, I think you can find it and then find local. Even if they're interested in sports, my daughter did a camp up at Kutztown for tennis, and it was not related to anything, but she had a chance to see the campus. No, I liked it, I didn't like it. And those are things in the summer you can try and do. They are expensive.
Thank you.
Thank you. You guys are great.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Appreciate it.